This is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It's Thursday, August the 17th, 2023. Last week, I had a great conversation with Rion Amilcar Scott on what we called literary insurrections, mimetic apocalypses. Those were his terms. He's the author of a very well-received collection of short stories, The World Doesn't Require You. And we talked about social media, and particularly Black Twitter, his involvement with it, his embrace of it, and the future of Twitter or X or whatever we want to call the new Musk social media platform. Another very distinguished writer who has been associated with Twitter is my guest today, Deesha Philyaw. She is the author of a brilliant new book. It's actually not so new, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies. It's won all the awards. It's a fascinating collection of stories. And I'm thrilled that she is joining us, Deesha from Houston, Texas. Deesha, welcome.
Thanks, Andrew.
So congratulations on the book. We'll get to the book later, but you joined, at least according to your Twitter or your X page, I don't know what we call it now, you joined in August 2009. Do you remember your first tweet, why you joined?
I don't remember my first tweet, but I remember using Twitter to crowdsource my wedding shoes. I remember that was one of my early tweets.
What does that mean, crowdsource your wedding?
I wanted people to give me ideas and give me feedback on what shoes I should have for my wedding. I was getting married for the second time. I have since gotten divorced, so I'm no longer married to that person. But I remember that as one of my early tweets. It's like, hey, this is what I'm wearing. This is what my wedding dress looks like. What kind of shoes should I have? And all these strangers weighed in.
Do you remember when the time, or approximately when you first heard the term Black Twitter, what it actually meant, what it should mean?
If I'm not mistaken, for me, the moment that crystallized Black Twitter was when there was a woman, Justine, I don't remember her last name, a white woman who said something really racist as she was taking a flight to Africa. And by the time she landed, she had been fired.
Yeah, that was an AIDS remark saying, I think she joked, it wasn't a very funny joke, I've got AIDS. And then she said, no, I'm only joking, I'm white.
Yeah. I forgot the specifics, but that was a moment where I felt this sort of groundswell of Black folks on Twitter, talking about the seriousness of her comment, but also joking. And then somebody contacted her employer, and all of these things sort of happening in this collective of people who are all over the world, all on our little devices, but focused on this one moment. And that's when I first felt like a part of Black Twitter.
The woman's life was, I guess, ruined. Did you have any sympathy with her? I mean, clearly it was an incredibly dumb and offensive things to say, but as she claimed, she was joking.
The right word, because there's been where are they now? All of these folks who, allegedly have had their lives ruined. She's fine. It's not like she wasn't able to get another job or whatever. But am I grateful that, there was no Twitter when I was her age and younger? Absolutely. Because if all of us, had the ability to broadcast the worst things we've ever said, as younger people, though she wasn't young. So no, I'm not particularly sympathetic. I think she's perfectly fine.
We had Christian Cooper on the show last month, the Central Park bird watcher guy who also got involved in another Twitter or social media controversy. News spreads fast on these platforms, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, Twitter is my primary news source. And so, news breaks on Twitter, for me, at least, before anywhere else. It used to be Facebook was a few days behind, but Facebook is also, starting to kind of keep pace. I think with the changes at Twitter, now X, I see more people active and sharing news and breaking news and doing commentary on Facebook more now than previously. But for a long time, you know, it was really Twitter.
Do you bemoan the fact that we don't call it Twitter anymore?
I still call it Twitter. I bemoan everything that's happened over there, but I am very reluctant and recalcitrant in that I'm going to call it Twitter. I'm going to call these tweets and retweets. I'm not changing my language around it. But yeah, it is absolutely unfortunate what happened.
Deesha, a lot of people have written about Black Twitter, Meredith Clark, someone else I think we're going to get on the show. She's written a dissertation on it. What for you does it mean? What is it? It
is, for me, Black Twitter is a virtual representation of the community I grew up in the South. In Jacksonville, Florida, when I was growing up, where there was this sort of kinship and fellowship around with other Black folks, even though we're not, you know, all the same, we're not a monolith, but there were just certain things that we kind of rallied around, a certain way of approaching the slings and barbs that come our way, a certain joy, a certain insistence on looking out for each other. And here it is in this sort of digital space where, you know, the fact that we'll make a joke out of almost anything, and our humor is unparalleled. You know, some of the funniest people I remember in my life were the older people I grew up with. I grew up in a very intergenerational household. And so Twitter is the closest approximation that I've had to that since I left Florida.
When you joined in 2009, of course, Obama was president. When you think back and when you remember the America of 2009, what occurs to you between the politics of the time and the growth of Twitter and Black Twitter?
My goodness, it was a more innocent time. You know, some of us really thought that Obama was going to, you know, change the world. I remember sitting on the couch and watching his inauguration on television and tweeting at the same time and crying for the moment, imagining if my mother and my grandmother, you know, were still alive, and, you know, how they would might be feeling in that moment. And so I look back and think, gosh, I was so naive to think that, you know, one man and one presidency up against, you know, all of these systemic forces at play. But I still cherish that memory. You know, that's what I mean. Like it's about community, that like there are things that come along later that are awful, but we still have these memories of community and family and fellowship. And that's what I remember from that time. And then looking back kind of wistfully at, I don't like the good old days sort of thing. It was because that was truly, we just didn't know. It's not that, you know, things were, there was this idyllic conditions. It was just, we didn't know what was coming. We didn't know what was coming.
Do you have a nostalgia for that innocence back in 2009?
You know, I don't know if it's a nostalgia for the innocence, but it's definitely a nostalgia for a couple of things. One being, there were always these forces at play, as I said, but we know with the election of Donald Trump, those forces were empowered and emboldened. So I definitely long for a time before that, but also a time before a lot of the conscious branding that was happening on Twitter, and Black Twitter, you know, hasn't been immune to that, where people got on just to check in with the community, just to, you know, laugh and joke and lament and all of the things that we did. And it felt more organic and genuine. And then I was away from Twitter for a few years, came back around 2015, 2016 or so. And suddenly we have influencer culture and brands and that. And I think that shifted the culture of Twitter, of Black Twitter. And I would, you know, I long for a time before that when you could sort of see people tweeting and it felt very forced and it felt like I'm trying to go viral. Whereas, people would go viral for being funny or poignant or on point for, just effortlessly and just naturally, and not for clout, as people say now.
I was going to ask you the influencer question. What is an influencer in your mind? And when you came back to Twitter in 2015, 16, what were you hearing about this term influencer? What did it mean and how new was it?
I felt like I had missed the wave, that while I was kind of off of social media actively for a few years, I came back and the influencers weren't just on Twitter, or even primarily, I think a lot of it was Instagram, and then TikTok. And it's not that I'm averse to, or, think there's anything wrong with branding, because I also use Twitter to brand, because I wrote a co-parenting book that came out in 2013. And so I certainly use Twitter to, to sell books and push this idea of, civil co-parenting after divorce. But I always hope that I did it in a way that was genuine and sincere. It didn't, I don't think anything I did felt like what I was seeing, where folks who I thought were just naturally funny and fun to be, around in this virtual space. It all felt very orchestrated, and it was all very much about getting your follower counts up, and everything felt very curated. And I sort of missed the messiness of the times past. And there's nothing wrong with people being influencers. I'm not mad at anyone who ethically is trying to get a bag, but it, to the extent that it takes away from the more sort of community feeling of people not just trying to sell you something or to monetize things, to the extent that that's eroded some of the relational aspects of it, I do lament that. But I don't have a problem with, people pursuing being an influencer, as long as it's done, ethically and respectfully.
Do you think there's a generational quality, Deesha, to the influencer economy, or the idea of influencers, that it seemed to seduce not the first generation of, or even the second generation of social media users, but younger people who thought that they could make a living through this?
Yeah, and at the risk of starting the generation wars, for me, a lot of the gap is, I see that they have this facility with video and with being able to quickly make this content and quickly respond and react to things, and this facility with the technology that I'm Gen X, that even some of us as Gen Xers don't have, and that is that new wave, that kind of third wave that you're speaking of, because certainly there were I sort of came of age on the internet in not came of age, that's not true, but my time on the internet, at the peak of it, I think, was during the blogger era, of where you went to individual sites before an Instagram and a TikTok, and a lot of the mommy blogging culture and those sorts of things. And so there was a shift even from there that focused a lot more on video content, a lot less on text. So a lot of us were writers and bloggers, and so we might have had blogs, but also books. And so with influencer culture, it's a lot more around lifestyle and a lot more around video content, a lot more, just the volume of content is different. And so I think that generationally, I don't know if it's that my generation can't keep up. It's just, at least for me, it's not how I want to use my time. I would rather take my time to, write a long form essay or something like that. And so I see that world as not really for me. And even as I think as an author about books, like I know there's book talk, and I'm like, that's just not going to be the place where I'm going to be promoting my books. Now on book talk, there are others who are promoting my book, which I really appreciate, because it would take me like a week to make a video for TikTok, and they can do it like in an hour. So I absolutely respect that.
So you came back to social media 2015, 16. I'm guessing there was a political element there
Oh, I'm
too. I
sorry.
mean, you.
Hang on, there's somebody coming to mow the grass. I am so sorry.
It may be Elon Musk.
It's hard to hear. Hang on, let's see. They're passing, so it should pass in a moment. Okay, I can hear you now.
I was joking, Deesha. It's probably Elon Musk.
Yes.
Actually, it's probably the Trump people, because we're coming up to politics now.
I will say this is as critical as I have been. One thing I have not done is I've not been critical of Twitter on Twitter, or critical of him on Twitter. Not out of fear, but it's like, I just, I'm not trying to do anything to draw attention and get involved. And, there's such a pettiness to how, this new owner has handled things. And I just have been more of an observer and a commentator elsewhere, but not on the platform itself. And I've tried all of the other platforms, by the way. I have accounts everywhere because I wanted to preserve my name. I still remain active primarily on Twitter versus any of the Twitter.
Have any of the other ones resonated? TikTok, Instagram, Thread?
So I have been on Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. Those are my core three. I have accounts at Thread, Blue Sky, Spoutable, Spill, you name it, I'm there. But I signed on, poked around a little bit, and then those aren't places I check every day the way I check Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, if not every day, almost every day.
So you got on in the summer of 2009, August. Mm-hmm. So that makes it, I was going to say 24. My math is not good. 14 years ago.
Yes.
And then you came back 2015, 2016. America was, of course, a very different place from Obama to Trump. Did you return because of politics?
I'm trying to think what brought me back. It might have been. I remember that during that time I was on Facebook more, arguing with people. In the sort of lead up to the election. And I think the other thing that was happening around that time, I mentioned, that I ended up getting divorced, and that, my relationship was ending. And I know that at that time I felt that sense of community again. And I think maybe subconsciously I was coming back for that sense of community, and Twitter, and Black Twitter in particular, didn't disappoint. I was also working on what would become the Secret Lives of Church Ladies. And so that's when I started to, start to connect with more writers on Twitter, more than I had been previously, when I had been on Twitter previously. So there's literary Twitter or writer Twitter, there's, and then there's subgenres even of that. So, connecting with other writers was different. And I wasn't doing the co-parenting stuff anymore. So I have two Twitter accounts, the one under my name and then the co-parenting 101 account. And so I just came back under my name. And so it's sort of like a second act, I guess.
Well, this was our first act. We're talking with Deesha Philyaw, the author of The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, about her social media history. We're going to talk more about that. Also going to talk about her book. But for the moment, we're going to take a short break. We want to thank our sponsor, Liberties, a quarterly journal of culture and politics, a very independent, defiantly independent, non-digital publication. I'm going to run a short ad, and then we'll be back with Deesha to talk more about social media in the Trump age, and of course her wonderful book.
Beyond the news, the noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas, it's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And then you can find it at libertiesjournal.com for anyone interested. So, Deesha, we were talking before the break about your return to social media in 2015-16, the beginnings of an influence economy. How different was it? Not so much in terms of the rise of influencers, but in terms of the tenor, the kinds of conversations that you were hearing in 2015, 16 that you didn't hear in 2009?
I think, I don't know if it was so much that the conversation changed than it was, I was less in a bubble. I think in my early incarnation on Twitter, I definitely was in sort of a little bubble and I didn't have as many followers and I wasn't following as many people. When I returned, I was following a lot more people. I was, touching other parts of Twitter than I had been previously. And I started to notice two things that started to happen. And certainly now they've kind of reached a fever pitch, which is the sort of racism and fascism that, we see played out on Twitter, but also some silencing around anti-racist voices, and sort of these two very different kinds of movements or perspectives. And I had to kind of make a decision for myself, like, how much time do I want to engage with either? And so after initially being a lot more engaged, sort of like, I'm back and it's a bit of a frenzy, then I realized, oh, this could be a real time sink. And I really had to think about how much time I was devoting to social media, and how it was influencing me overall, my mood and everything else, and what was my purpose there, because it certainly had changed. It was no longer just about being with my folks, being in community, being with Black Twitter. It was a lot broader. This idea of the discourse of the day. How often do I want to get involved in that? Nowadays, rarely. Who's going to be the main character on Twitter today? All of that. And so after initial time of getting involved in whatever the hot topics were for the day, I tended to back up a little bit and observe a lot more than I engaged. I also noticed over time, since the 2016, when they introduced the quote tweet option, I rarely quote tweet now, except to say nice things and support other writers or other folks, as opposed to quote tweeting to engage in debate. I don't really like debating on Twitter anymore. That's a huge shift. I used to do a lot of I don't even know if I can swear on here, shit talking.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, a lot of shit talking on Twitter.
Yeah.
And that caught up with me recently when I went to a writing festival and was there with another writer who's quite prominent, and we connected right away. And I was like, how do I tell her that years ago on Twitter, I was talking shit about her?
Oh my God.
And because I think we're going to be friends. And I just felt like I needed to say, there was this time when, she was kind of the main character, or someone she was adjacent to was the main character of the day on Twitter. And a lot of us were kind of taking some shots at her. And it reminded me of how different I use Twitter now. Like, I wouldn't do that now. And so I confessed and I apologized to her, and she laughed, and we had a good conversation about it.
You use this term, main character of the day, on Twitter. What does that mean?
That means the person who has drawn everyone's attention, and usually their ire, for doing something either ridiculous or unconscionable, or, they've, as we say, put their foot in their mouth on any given day.
Since 2016, of course, you yourself, you may not have gone viral on Twitter, but you've gone viral more broadly in terms of the success of your book. And there's an interesting piece in Slate, The Secret Life of Deesha Philyaw. Of course, your book, your prize-winning book, The Secret Lives of Church Ladies, has done extremely well. In the Slate piece, you talk about the rejection of your book and the problems of the publishing industry. How do you think that connects with social media? I guess the democratizing quality of a place like Twitter, where anyone can join and anyone can say anything, and publishing, where, for better or worse, the commanding heights are still controlled by a small group literary folk?
Yeah, I think, I don't even know that it's those two things that, social media culture. I think the main way it doesn't prepare writers for the reality of the publishing world is this idea of taking your time, the idea of revision, which are really big in publishing and writing in general. And social media doesn't lend itself to that, there's no edit button on Twitter unless you pay for it now. And so you put things out there, and for better or worse, it's out there, unless you delete it. But also this idea that, we don't necessarily sit with our thoughts, or we don't have to. We can just put them out there and people can react and it can go viral, and all the endorphins and all of the rush of good feeling of having people agree with us or like what we said. Whereas in publishing, it's years before you can get there. If you ever get there, there's a lot of rejection. There's a lot of this is fine, but, and so social media culture and pace does not prepare you for the pace of publishing, for being asked to revise, for being asked to reconsider, for being asked to rewrite and rethink and all of that. There's urgency in both worlds, but they manifest in different ways. What is the phrase we use? Instant gratification. It's so easy to, as you said earlier, it's not necessarily about generations. I think a lot of us want the instant gratification, and social media gives us that. Publishing does not give us instant gratification, usually not typically. And so it can be really discouraging for folks who want to make the transition from, being an influencer or being popular on Twitter and then writing a book, and understanding that it's a whole other beast. It's a whole other muscle. If you need a lot of strokes, publishing is not going to give it to you for the most part, the way that social media does.
Cultural pessimists, of course, say, and they've said this about every new wave of technology, that it undermines attention and seriousness. A lot of people believe that social media does away with reading and books. Mm-hmm. But it seems as if in some ways, perhaps it creates an appetite for a more serious investigation. Do you think there's some truth to that?
I think it creates the appetite for those of us who are curious. And it also creates a way of finding out. Like if it wasn't for social media, I wouldn't know about most of the books. I mean, you go to the library, you go to the bookstore, and you have to wander around. But on any given day, there are lists and there's somebody recommending books and so forth. And so we are all now aware of more books than we could ever read in our lifetime. And that's thanks to social media. I don't know that I can speak to whether or not it shortened our attention spans. It hasn't shortened mine. I love a juicy, long form essay. Absolutely. Now, what I do think happened in the early days of the pandemic is we were so traumatized and stressed out. I think our attention span and ability to read long form things were probably, challenged and compromised. And so I know a lot of us were reading more flash fiction or flash nonfiction, or I think that's one reason that short story collections started to get the attention and the accolades I think they've always deserved. I don't think it's coincidental that happened around 2020. So I don't know if it's social media as much as it is our reading habits were affected in the early days of the pandemic. That's what I've observed.
And what about recent history? Of course, Black Lives Matter blew up, erupted, I guess is the right word, through social media, through the murder of George Floyd. What do you remember about that in the role of social media in Black Lives Matter and in the narrative around Floyd?
Again, that was in the early months of the pandemic. I believe he was killed in the spring of 2020, and we were just all, kind of starting to go into lockdown. I remember being very numb. I remember being very exhausted. I remember feeling a loneliness that was beyond even the physical isolation we were going through, and just, the horror of it all. And then to see the way the world literally rallied and came outside in a time when we were all terrified to be out and about, to decry, that this man was killed and how he was killed. And all in the back of our minds, of course, wasn't just the killing, but the fear, or perhaps the awareness that this cop was going to get away with it again, as it always had been. And so we're, bearing the weight of all of that, and the pandemic, and so for me, I remember, like, I couldn't tear myself away from social media. I felt like we were at a moment of collective grief, and it was through social media that we were connected. But going back a few years, it was really Trayvon Martin's murder, and the subsequent trial and all of that, where I feel that Black Twitter, that was definitely a family gathering, a family grieving, a family lament about this child's death, and then George Zimmerman getting away with it. Those, the roots, the Black Lives Matter, grew from there. So for me, social media and Black Lives Matter always sort of intersect in this place of collective grief for me. And awareness, yes. But I kind of cringe a little bit at, social media raised awareness. It's like, but for so many of us, we were always aware, and the question is, now that more people are aware, is anything going to change? And as we've now seen the erosion of efforts and commitment to justice and to change that happened since 2020, it feeds my cynicism that awareness and raising awareness isn't enough.
Do you remember where you were on January 6th, 2021, and how or why social media played a role then?
I was living in Pittsburgh, and I was off of social media that day, or in the early part of the day, because I had a meeting with my agent. And so for hours, when the Capitol was being pillaged, I didn't know until after it had happened. And, there were all of the videos and so forth, completely unaware until after the fact. But yeah, I remember exactly where I was.
And how would you respond to some people who would say, well, January 6th was just some people demonstrating, like Black Lives Matter was like some people demonstrating?
I always call bullshit on both sidesism. That I would not. I think that if someone, I think that's a disingenuous comparison. And I think even asking the question, the breach of the Capitol, of Nancy Pelosi's office, I mean, there is no comparison. Absolutely not.
Deesha, finally, you've mentioned loneliness a couple of times. I think psychologists have noted, researchers, that loneliness fell off the cliff in about 2012. People suddenly, a generation of Americans, particularly young Americans, became lonelier and lonelier. And of course, we now have what many people refer to as the age of anxiety. Is it any coincidence that we seem increasingly lonely in an age of social media, and social media is designed to allow us to connect with others? Unpack that one for me.
It is baffling to me, but it is absolutely something that I have experienced firsthand, and it drives how I engage with social media because I've observed it with myself. I will go to social media sometimes if I am feeling lonely, because I can, get that connection and that affirmation, or that, if we're grieving something or laughing about something. And then I notice that there are times where after a certain while, then I feel lonelier than I did before. So it's like a diminishing returns. I think that's what we call it, because there's no substitute for. As much as I have made great friends through social media, there is still no substitute for human touch, physical connection, literally breaking bread with someone. And so then there's a way that social media reminds you that it's not that, and it feeds the loneliness. And so what I've had to do for myself is find that sweet spot before we hit diminishing returns. I don't know what that dynamic is, but I absolutely experience it.